Well, hi everyone. It's good to see you all. Hi everybody online. So I'm a teacher, and I always like to start my classes explaining a little bit of who I am because I feel like that's helpful. A lot of you guys know me. Some of you online, I don't think we've met before, so you might find it useful to know this. I'll keep it short because you didn't come to hear about me. But I'm a historian, so that is one of the big things I do. I'm a historian. I'm also a Bible scholar. So I teach at numerous universities. I'm doing that tomorrow, the local university over here, on history and religion. So I am coming at this from that angle. It's sort of interesting because when you look at my topic, God's standards of morality are the only path to peace. It's difficult to prove this from the Bible. Now, here's what I mean by that. If I were to prove to you that God's standards of morality are the only path to peace using the Bible, that would be a very circular argument. In other words, I would be saying the Bible tells me that the Bible is right, which maybe that would be convincing, but that would really probably not be because of the good argument. Maybe it would be because I made it sound really good or something, but it wouldn't be because the Bible convinced you. Circular reasoning doesn't work. So what I'm going to attempt to do is I'm going to attempt to show that within the greater standard of humanity, the greater group of humanity, there's a problem, and the solution to it, the solution to this problem is the Bible. So that's going to be my goal. And I think I'm going to present, I'm hoping at least to present a few things that show here's how the Bible fills in the gaps. Here's how the Bible fills in the holes. So this is going to be heavy verses because I'm really looking at, I didn't want to have a circular argument. So instead, I'm going to present to you some data, and then we'll take a look. We'll eventually get to, here's the solution. And that's when we'll take a look at what the scriptures have to say about this. Okay, so God's standards of morality are the only path to peace. Here's the plan. We're going to look at how the world has a lack of peace. Now, specifically, I'm not talking about wars and that kind of thing, although there's a lot that you could look at as far as that goes right now. But we're going to be looking at a lack of individual peace. People just aren't feeling peace. They're not happy with life. Things aren't feeling good. And then we'll move on, second half, talking about true peace. I'm intending probably for about 30 to 40 minutes. That's my goal here. So each of these should probably be about 15 minutes. I also, in addition to lecturing at the universities, I also teach middle school. So I have found that people pay attention to me for maybe about like 2 or 3 minutes. And that's pretty good when that happens. Otherwise, like their minds will start wandering. So if that happens, that's okay. I'm not going to be upset. That's one of those things. That's how it goes. I understand. I'm not an easy person to offend. So I also put up for you a one-liner so that if you do find your mind wandering and you start thinking about dinner or dessert or whatever, you can remember this one line. Here's the big idea behind today's talk. God's standards of morality are the only path to peace. Now, that's pretty good. Sorry, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but I feel like it's pretty easy to remember because it's the title, basically, right? So this is the main message. This is the only way. It's really the only way that we can find peace is God's standards of morality. Now, I also like to ask questions. I have 4 children. They're always asking me why. So why kind of echoes in my mind. So here's the why question. Why is peace so elusive? So just think about that as we go through and we discuss peace together, because I think that's going to come out as we look at some of this data. We'll see peace is a really difficult thing to get, and maybe we'll be able to unearth why that is. So that's the plan. Lack of peace and true peace. We have those 2 sections. Main message is that God's standards of morality are the only path to peace. And we're going to open up why peace is so elusive. So here's a lack of peace, because it's actually peace is. Anyway, sorry. I saw that picture and I got really excited about it. So I had to put it in somewhere. Okay. You probably can't read this because it's real small, but basically what this says, this is from Medline Plus, which is from the National Library of Medicine. So this is US government official site, and it is a discussion of depression. Now, I am not a medical doctor. I'm a different kind of doctor. So I can't, I can't say that this is exactly how this goes, but this seemed like a pretty legitimate site to me. So essentially what this is saying, what I wanted to draw your attention to is I just wanted to have a definition here of what we're going to be talking about as we enter in and look at this lack of peace. And it's there in the second to last paragraph. It says, depression is a disorder of the brain. There are a variety of causes, including genetic, biological, environmental, and psychological factors. It can happen at any age, and it often begins in teens and young adults. It's much more common in women. Okay, so it's sort of interesting to just understand that when we start talking about depression, I think sometimes people will say things like, "Oh, I'm depressed" or whatnot. But this is much more of a condition. It's something that's diagnosable, and we want to note that as we jump into this. The reason that that's important to notice is this diagnosed condition is very strongly on the rise. So this is information from a Gallup poll. I actually have it presented in two different ways for you. This is the first one on a bar graph. So you can see here that in 2015, 20% of the people interviewed said they'd experienced depression during their lifetime. And then come 2023, 29% of the people interviewed said that they had experienced that. Now, again, this wasn't just I felt sad sort of thing, but this is, I have been diagnosed with depression at some point in my life, right? So that's what's being said here. So I just want you to notice the jump. Now, I'm not trying to pass judgment on anybody. Sometimes people talk about how depression has a stigma. I'm not trying to do anything along those lines. All I'm saying is that we can see from the data that there's a big jump, right? So as you go from 2020 to 2023, big jump. And that's interesting because you can see that connects to the time that the pandemic happened, right? So you'll just kind of notice that. All right, here it is on another chart. This one's officially from Gallup. The other one was from ABC News. This one has the green line. That's people that have been diagnosed with depression at any point in their life. And the line beneath it, that dark blue line, is that they are currently being treated for depression. So you'll notice that both of those are going up. So even once the pandemic stops, that trend continues, right? So we don't want to just say, oh, well, that's because of the pandemic. A lot of things are multifactorial and more complicated, but I think that that's just important to notice. So that's where we're starting. And if you're curious, you can actually break this down. You might have noticed that Medline Plus article on depression said that women are much more susceptible to it. So you can actually see here in the stats that for 2017, 14% of the respondents who were diagnosed with it in their lifetime were men, and then 26% were women. 14 versus 26. And then in 2023, it was 20 versus 36. Right, 20% versus 36. So it's just it's interesting to look at this. The other thing that really stands out to me here is when you look at age. I don't know if you can see that very well, but it's actually kind of scary that 18 to 29-year-olds, 34.3% said that they were diagnosed with it in their lifetime. And that was actually a 14% change. That was the highest percentage change in the course of this survey. So 18 to 29, there's been a big shift there. And you see a similar kind of shift with those that are currently being treated for depression. Okay, this is what Gallup had to say about this. Now, this is what I thought was the most helpful piece of what they put there in their interpretation of their survey. They said alarming rates of depression are not unique to the US. Globally, nearly 4 in 10 adults aged 15 and older either endure significant depression or anxiety themselves or have a close friend or family member who suffers from it. Other Gallup research has estimated that 22% of Northern American adults have experienced depression or anxiety so extreme that they could not continue regular daily activities for 2 weeks or longer, similar to a global rate of 19% and matching estimates found in Western Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa and South Asia, right? So you can see this is a global kind of thing, right? Okay, interesting. Clinical depression has been slowly rising in the US prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, but has jumped noticeably in its wake. Social isolation, loneliness, fear of infection, psychological exhaustion, particularly among frontline responders such as healthcare workers, elevated substance abuse, and disruptions in mental health services have all likely played a role. While experiences of significant daily loneliness have subsided in the past 2 years amid widespread vaccinations and a slow return to normalcy, elevated loneliness experiences during the pandemic likely played a substantive role in increasing the rates of the longer-term chronic nature of depression. Currently, 17% of US adults report experiencing significant loneliness yesterday, projecting to an estimated 44 million people. So that's just for us to get an idea of diagnosed depression rates. I think it's just helpful to be aware of, to see that that's on the upswing. Now, I want to talk about something that isn't diagnosable, because this is also a thing that I think is related. This is called dysphoria. Anybody here heard of that before? Dysphoria? Yeah, okay. Few people. So dysphoria is kind of interesting. I'm not talking about gender dysphoria. That's a whole different thing. But dysphoria is essentially the opposite of euphoria. Right? So euphoria is where you feel really happy. Dysphoria is essentially feeling very sad. So this is the definition here. Dysphoria is a profound sense of unhappiness, distress, and indifference. It's not a diagnosis, so it's often connected to depression, but it's sort of seen as like not quite depression yet, right? Which is why it's not diagnosed. But I want to bring that up because you see dysphoria being reflected, I think, in the general happiness of the country. So we started with depression, and now we're getting a little broader here to dysphoria. Though it's not a clinical diagnosis on its own, this is the last paragraph there, it may be an early warning sign of depression. So you can see it's all connected here. And this is what I want us to note. This is the General Happiness Survey of US adults from 1973 to 2016. So I couldn't find one that was totally updated. So we're looking at 8-year-old data. But just notice this. You can see a downward trend, right? Now let me tell you how this was rated. This was a very simple survey. It's always helpful to know the methodology of these things. So here's how it worked. Adults were approached and they were asked, do you feel very happy, pretty happy, or not happy? It was very simple. Do you feel very happy, pretty happy, or not happy? And so very happy was coded with a 3, pretty happy was coded with a 2, and not happy was coded with a 1, right? So this is how they did it. And then they graphed that, right? So they took averages and whatnot. So what you have here is that in 1973, the score was 2.25. So most adults said that they felt between pretty happy and very happy. Now we are down at 2.16. Now, that's not a huge difference, but you can see that there's a trend. Now, where it gets really interesting is actually when you break this down to not adults, but you actually start asking middle schoolers and high schoolers. So where this has gone is now those in 10th grade are 1.97. So you can see that there's this, something happened essentially around 2010 where everything went. That's a little strange. I've heard some people point this to the introduction of the iPhone. I'm not going to get into that, but that is very interesting. So anyway, I don't know about that. You know, I study history, so that's not really in my wheelhouse. But I think it's interesting to just kind of take a look at this and to see this data. In fact, Gallup notes, this is from 2022. They wrote an article called "The Global Rise of Unhappiness." That this is not just a U.S. thing. It's the whole world. So they already noted that depression is increasing in the whole world, but it's not just depression. It's actually just being sad in general. Right? A lot less people feel happy now than they used to. Okay. So this is the unhappiness scale according to Gallup. So you can again see a big trend. In 2006, it was at 24. That was anger, stress, and sadness. It was lower. And now it's up to a 33. So definitely on the upswing. Okay, so a lot of people have noticed this. And so you maybe have noticed that within the last few years, there's been a big explosion of psychological techniques and tools to try and de-stress or try and stop anxiety, right? So this is from the Calm app, right? So if you're looking online, I just found this going on and saying, okay, what are some techniques for feeling happy, right? So you have things like the Calm app where they give suggestions. So this is 12 essential mindfulness practices for cultivating inner peace. Okay. Now I'm not going to say that these are bad, right? I don't want anybody to kind of leave saying, oh, okay, so this is the kind of stuff we should avoid this. I don't think that. I think a lot of these things can be helpful, right? So if you find yourself as one of those people that is experiencing depression or sad or whatnot, you might find some of these things to be really useful, and that's great. So here's what they suggest. Here's their 12 things. Meditate, live in the present, cultivate a positive mindset, develop love for yourself, practice self-care, visualize a peaceful place, learn to breathe effectively. Now, what I think they mean by that is actually practice deep breathing. But I mean, breathing effectively would probably make you feel better too. But I'm not sure what's going on there. That's kind of interesting. Access nature, be grateful, work on acceptance, practice non-judgment, and foster deep connections. Again, I think these are good things to do. But what I would suggest is they're still missing something. You know, if you do all these things, you will experience, I think, peace to an extent, but you won't have true peace. They're missing something that's going to bring that true peace. So it's good, it's helpful, but, not quite. Here's another one for you. This is Oprah Daily, right? So Oprah always has good advice. So here's what she says. How to find inner peace and happiness in the chaos. Here we go. Breathe in, breathe out, right? So make sure that you're not just breathing in. You got to also breathe out. Number 2, feel the truth that you're safe and loved. Visualize your happy place. Read the story you're telling yourself. In other words, that's kind of like look at the big picture and then act your way to deeper self-compassion, or like fake it till you make it kind of idea, right? Now, I mean, these are pretty good, although I somewhat disagree with number 2 because you might not actually be safe, and hopefully you are loved, but, it's some really unfortunate situations that might be a little bit of a struggle for some people. So while these are good, again, there's some problems. They're really not dealing with the big thing that we need to spend time dealing with, and that's this. So we've seen that depression is rising, dysphoria, unhappiness, that is rising, and different people are trying to express, here are ways to deal with that. A lot of those are good, but they're not complete. And I think that's one of the big issues. Humans are complex, and sometimes we're really into the idea of like a simple solution. We want things to be simple. We want to say, okay, just tell me this to fix me, or tell me this to make me happy or whatnot. And that's not really how it works. Sometimes being happy is a combination of a lot of things, but we can't forget the key thing. Now, before I go into this key thing, I do want to note, please, let's just acknowledge, I'm not trying to give any kind of medical advice, right? So I'm not trying to say that if you have been diagnosed with depression, here's what you're going to do and it's going to make everything great. That's not what I mean by that. What I mean is this is a key piece in finding peace, right? This is one of the major things that we do need to think about, because without this, I think it's going to be very challenging. So here's something else that's interesting. This is now from the Pew Research Center. 2019, Pew noted that in the US, the decline of Christianity is continuing at a rapid pace. Take a look at this chart that you can't actually look at because it's probably too small. So what they noted was in 2007, this is self-identification. So they would go up, they'd survey people and say, are you a Christian? In 2007, 78% of the people in the US said yes. Fast forward to 2019, that 78 has become 65. That's a pretty big decline for just 12 years. So, in contrast, this is now the bottom line there, that gray one. In contrast, in 2007, 16% said they were religiously unaffiliated, whereas in 2019, 26% said they were religiously unaffiliated. They were a none. right? None being that they have no connection whatsoever. So you can definitely see that that is on the rise, whereas Christianity is going down. Now, this is Gallup. It's a similar sort of thing, but Gallup now comes 3 years later in 2022. They say belief in God in the US dips to 81%, a new low. Now, this isn't Christianity. This is just God in general, right? So we had belief as a Christian going down, and now we're going to see that it's even more general than that. Just belief in God goes down. Now, what's crazy about this is that Gallup actually started this poll in 1942. So get this. From 1942 to 2010, belief in God in the United States essentially stayed the same. That's kind of crazy and pretty impressive too, I'd say. So for about 70 years, it stayed the same. And then from 2010 to 2020, it decreased by about 15%. Belief in God decreases by 15% down to 81%. Now, by the way, that's actually significantly better than most other Western countries. So when I was in Australia, I was talking to people about this and they were like, what? People in the United States, there's 81% who believe in God? It's only 40 here. And they felt all excited, like, wow, I can't believe you live in such a godly place. And I was like, no, guys, it's going down. Like that's bad. That just didn't really work for them. So anyway, it was that was fascinating to me. Now, I want to, again, because I spend a lot of time doing research, looking at data, I want to be really careful with how I present this. Correlation does not imply causation. What I mean is, just because we're looking at depression rates and we say, oh, look, they're going up. We're looking at dysphoria rates and we're seeing, oh, look, they're going up. And then we also see that belief in God is going down. You can't just say, aha, see? Because people stopped believing in God, they're sad, right? That doesn't work. You can't say that kind of thing. What I want to present is there is a correlation, there appears to be, between the two. Now, to really say that for sure, we'd have to actually go and measure year by year by year. We don't have the time to do that tonight, but if you're interested, go ahead and do it, and I'd love to hear about how that goes. But I think we can say there appears to be a correlation. And that's just something interesting to note, because what I want to suggest is, in fact, a key part of peace is God's standards of morality. And so there is going to be dysphoria, there is going to be unhappiness when God's standards of morality get left behind. That is going to be something that happens. This is one of the key things for happiness. So let's just take a look at how that goes. All right, this is my thesis for you. Here's my proposal. I think that happiness requires 3 things. Now, before you laugh, because that's a simplification, I want to just acknowledge, yes, that's obviously an oversimplification. It's not like when you say, I'm feeling sad today. Let me walk through these 3 things and then I'll feel happy. That's not what I mean. It's not how it goes. But I do think that these are foundational for happiness and joy and peace. So here's what they are. Number 1, you have to start with a belief in God. That's the first thing. A belief in God, because without that, life is basically meaningless. Right? What's the purpose here without that? There isn't a purpose. So when you have belief in God, you can then build upon that, and you can recognize that God is in control. That then decreases anxiety, and that leads you then to number 3, which is embracing purpose for your life and feeling as though, this is what I'm supposed to do. And that feeling, that's joyful. Right? When you know this is what I'm supposed to be doing, here's things I can do, here's how I can give meaning to my life. So let's talk about these 3 things. Let's talk about true peace, these 3 pieces of happiness. Number 1 is belief in God. So in order to come to this, we are going to talk about Blaise Pascal. Anybody know Pascal? Pascal was a French mathematician. He was a mathematical genius who apparently was working on, he wrote a paper, this blew my mind, on conic structures when he was 16. Who does that, right? Come on. I don't even think I could write a paper on conic structures right now. So this is Pascal. He also, by the way, invented the first calculator. Kind of interesting. Now, that's not actually what we care about. So that just establishes he was a smart dude. Okay, well, one of the things that he thought about a lot as a mathematician was, can I use math to prove the existence of God? So this is known as Pascal's wager. So you maybe heard of it before. I think it's pretty fantastic. So let me just read this to you. This was published after he died. It was in a book called Pensis, which means things he was thinking about. And this is the translation of his words of this wager. So he says, let us then examine this point. God is or he is not. And so here's the question. God is or God is not. Which side shall we incline? Reason can decide nothing here. There is an infinite chaos which separated us. A game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance where heads or tails will turn up. What will you wager? According to reason, you can do neither the one thing nor the other. According to reason, you can defend neither of the propositions. So what he's saying is, reasonably, you can't deduce evidence that says, here's God, here's not God. So he's trying to say, okay, so put that aside. All these people, he was part of the Enlightenment, so everybody was all about reason. So he says, you got to put aside the reason, and instead, let's actually think logically about how this affects your life. So he said, forget trying to come up with evidence as to whether or not God exists, but think about, how does it affect your life, the choice that you make? He says, do not then reprove for error those who have made a choice, for you know nothing about it. No, but I blame them for having made not this choice, but a choice. For again, both he who chooses heads and he who chooses tail are equally at fault. They are both in the wrong. The true course is not to wager at all. So what he comes to is, you know what? Most people will just say, well, I've just decided it's better to not decide at all. Does God exist? God doesn't exist. I don't know. And so I'm just going to kind of stand in the middle and not make a choice. And he says, yes, but you must wager. It is not optional. Because his argument goes on to say, if you say, I don't know, you've already said God doesn't exist. Because God requires something of you. And so by not doing those things, you've automatically said, I don't think God exists. So this is Pascal. He is so logical. I love this. Now, we're not going to read all of this because he's writing in like the 16th century and the translation's not very fun to read. But basically what he says here is, let's play this out. In life, if you follow God, it may be a little bit harder for you, right? There may be times where you have to say, you know, I really want to do that, but I'm not going to. So he says, let's just put this on a chart. If you follow God, you have finite sadness, right? There are going to be times where maybe you could have lived a more fun life or a more exciting life if you didn't follow God. So he says you have finite sadness on one end. But what do you have to gain if God exists? He says you have infinite happiness. Interesting. So finite sadness, infinite happiness. And then he says, okay, well, that's interesting. If God doesn't exist, then what do you have? So he puts this together on a chart. So here you have God exists. If you therefore believe in God, you have infinite gain. If you don't believe in God, well then, finite loss. If God does not exist and you believe in God, finite loss. But if God does not exist and you have no belief in God, finite gain. In other words, his point is, there's only one here that makes any sense. You have finite gain or finite loss in 3 of these quadrants. And yet you have infinite gain in one of these. And the only one that is infinite gain is if God exists and there's belief in God. Right? Because with all the other ones, right, you're just going to die, and that's the end. But if God exists, then infinity is before you. So what he says is, logically, why would you not believe in God? And what's the point? You have an infinite gain, and then it turns out that you're wrong. Well, you have a finite loss. Oh well, but that's kind of what you were going to have anyway. So why not? So that's kind of interesting. So that's point number one. That's his wager. So you have to believe in God. And I think that makes a lot of sense. That's just a very logical approach to that. Now then, the second thing is, I think, to feel this peace, not only do we have to believe in God, but then we have to recognize that God is in control, and this decreases the anxiety. Now, Olivia Fox-Cobain here that you see on the screen, she's not like Pascal. She's not a mathematical genius, although she is French like him. So, I don't know why I'm putting a bunch of French people up here, but for some reason, that was how that went. Anyway, Cobain worked with Stanford in their student leadership development, right? So she does have some pretty good credentials. She's known for researching charisma, which is kind of interesting. Now, one of the things that really struck me in her charisma research is she said, in order to create charisma, first she says charisma is a choice. You have to decide, I'm going to be charismatic. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, she says the number one thing to creating charisma is getting rid of anxiety. Because if you're feeling anxiety, then you're going to be anxious, freaked out, and other people around you might feel like, oh no, did I make them upset or something like that? So what she says is, here's how you get rid of anxiety. The single most effective technique I've found to alleviate the discomfort of uncertainty is the responsibility transfer. Now, that's a fancy name that she came up with for placing responsibility in the hands of a higher power. She says that is the big way, the most effective way I've ever found in working with CEOs, movie stars, all of this, to decrease anxiety is to say someone bigger than you is in control. I thought that was fascinating. She says in uncertain situations, what we really want to know is that things are somehow going to work out fine. If we could be certain that things will work out, that everything will be taken care of, the uncertainty would produce much less anxiety. And that's fascinating because that's what Scripture tells us. All things work together for good to those who are the called and who love God, right? So we have that coming from Scripture itself, and thus leading to that idea of peace. So not only do we believe in God, but when we believe in God, then we can recognize that God is in control, and that can begin to lead to peace because we can start to put aside that anxiety. That doesn't mean that when we believe in God, we're never going to be anxious, right? But at least we have a tool now and a belief that we can lean on. In fact, I think it's pretty exciting because it even completely flips around the things that are bad, the things that we would typically perceive as bad. It's not just that, oh, somebody bigger is in control, but it's actually everything in my life is working the way it's supposed to because God is working. So that's why James can say, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Right? You know that God is working, that he's creating in you what is necessary. He's making this steadfastness. This is why Peter, when he's writing to the Christians all throughout Asia Minor, who are going to be burned by Nero, that's why when he says, don't be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you. Right, so this is that burning by Nero. He says, rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings. Recognize that just as Christ went through this and then was raised from the dead and given this glorious body, the same thing's happening to you. God is working all of this together. So we have, when we believe in God, when we recognize that he's in control, we have this supernatural responsibility transfer that we can use, that even people outside of Christianity have recognized is a key. This is the final piece. And to me, this is the most exciting. This is purpose. Because I feel like even if you come to the point where you say, okay, I believe in God, and I know that God is working in my life, still, there's some problems there. Because even with that, we can get selfish, right? We can be looking at our own lives and we can say, oh, so God is working in my life and it's really all about me. It's all about how he's going to make my life better. It's all about me listening to what he's going to say. and me changing, self-improvement, all of this kind of thing. And yet, Scripture, actually, God's standards of morality, I think, show us something different. And to me, this is where it gets so exciting. God's standards of morality show us that we have to go beyond that, and it gives us a purpose. Look at this purpose. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility, count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. So there's our purpose. Start thinking beyond yourself. Start thinking about other people and what can you do for them. Now, that is so exciting because when we isolate ourselves and we're just thinking about ourselves, we can really just get drawn in and we start thinking about our own lives and we fixate on this and, what's going to happen tomorrow and how's this going to go? And yet, when we start to think about other people and what can I do for them? How can I encourage them to think more about Christ? This is huge in terms of giving us purpose, giving us meaning. And thus, this is what Christianity is all about. Because Paul says, isn't this what Jesus did? Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Now, I think that this is so cool because this is the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were in the form of God, right? They were made in his image and likeness. And yet, they did want equality with God. It was all about selfishness. They see that the tree is good for food. It will make you wise. And they say, aha, this is it. This is for me. And yet Christ is the opposite. He says, this is for everybody else. That's what our religion, that's what Christianity is all about. And so that's why when Christ is asked, what is the greatest commandment? He says it's love the Lord your God, right? The second, he then says, is love your neighbor as yourself. And I want to just suggest those two go together. We do the first commandment, love the Lord your God, by doing the second one, by loving our neighbor as ourselves. Right? These two commandments work together. When we love our neighbors as ourselves, that's when we're loving God. So, God's standards for morality, this new way to live, where he takes us and says, it's not about you, it's about other people. This is what brings true peace because it really gives us purpose. Yes, we believe that God exists, that's the beginning, and then we recognize that he's in control, so we can work on putting aside our anxiety, but the biggest thing is we have meaning, and the meaning is to go out and live for other people.